can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sand. And right now, I feel like 100 grand.
You are listening to Inspired Insider with your host, Dr. Jeremy Wise.
Dr. Jeremy Weiss here, founder of InspiredInsider.com, where I talk with inspirational entrepreneurs and leaders. Today is no different. I have Marc Binkley. You could check him out. He's president of the Calgary Marketing Association, CalgaryCMA.com, also runs Quatical. You can check it out, Quatical.com. And Marc, before I formally introduce you, I always like to point out other episodes of the podcast people should check out. Since this is part of the top marketing and agency series, some of the other episodes, I had Kevin Hurrigan on of Spinutech, and Kevin started an agency in 1995. So it was interesting to hear the landscape of the internet, business, and agency life then. So that was really a good one. We had Todd Taskey on. Todd talks about how he helps basically connect private equity with agencies. So he helps sell agencies. He has a Second Bite podcast. So he finds that, agency owner will sell. And sometimes when that private equity sells again, sometimes those owners make more on the second bite than they do on the first. So it's really interesting to hear about the M&A space and valuation space and also the agency world as well. And that and many more on InspiredInsider.com. This episode is brought to you by Rise25. Rise25, we help businesses give to and connect to their dream relationships and partnerships. How do we do that? We do that by helping you run your podcast. And we're an easy button for a company to launch and run a podcast. We do the strategy, the accountability, and the full execution. So, Marc, we call ourselves the magic elves that run in the background and make it look easy for the hosts so they can create amazing content, amazing relationships. Most importantly, run their business. For me, the number one thing in my life is relationships, and I'm always looking at ways to give to my best relationships. And I've found no better way over the past 15 years to profile the people and companies I most admire and share with the world what they're working on. So if you have questions, you can go to rise25.com and you can email us at support@rise25.com. So Marc has a podcast too, which we'll talk about. So I believe if you have a business, you should have a podcast, period. And so I'm excited to introduce Marc Binkley, he's president of the Calgary Marketing Association. The CMA was founded in 2001. It's a nonprofit that supports Calgary's thriving marketing community. He also runs Quatical, where he's a fractional CMO, serving companies in the B2B tech, SaaS, transportation, utilities, retail, and professional services. He, as I mentioned, has a podcast called the Sleeping Barber Podcast. Marc, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Jeremy. It's fun sitting on this side of the mic.
Yeah. I actually like this side better because I get to ask the questions. But talk about for a second, I'll have you just talk about the Calgary Marketing Association and what you do there, and then we'll talk about Quatical. Yeah,
sure. So the Calgary Marketing Association is, I believe it's the second biggest marketing association in Canada. Relatively speaking to a lot of places in the U.S., Canada's kind of a rounding error, so it's small by other standards. But in Canada, it's a really sizable organization. I think we've got about 1,600 individuals that are members now, and really is a reflection of the Calgary marketing community, or Calgary business community. And we've got lots of people in agency, lots of people in B2B. Typically, they're, I would say, mid-career, and we've got different forums. We've got different levels of sponsorship. We run a whole bunch of different kinds of events, and so it's been really. I started in this role in April, and it's been a really interesting ride over the last few weeks.
How did that role come about?
Well, the original president that had been in this position for 10 years retired, and she did an amazing job building this up to what it is today. And it literally, when she took over, her name's Sydney, she had inherited this organization, and at the time was essentially just a golf tournament. And so they did that once a year. And then so from that, she built it into all these different things. So I always think about it as like I inherited this house with great bones. And so now I'm, as a renovator, looking at, what can I do with this, and how do I improve it, and how do I enhance it? So it's been very exciting because we've got a really engaged community and lots of great people. Lots of people are making some really big contributions, not just to our community, but globally to a lot of different things in marketing. And so, a big part of what we're trying to do, I mean, the vision behind the CMA is actually to make Calgary known as a world-class marketing community. And so my role is to help make that come to reality.
I mean, the same principles apply, right? Growing a company to growing a association as members. What are some of the things that you are doing with the CMA that, people can apply to their business also?
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a video piece to this. We are looking at the CalgaryCMA.com here, and we can see some of the stuff that, obviously has grown from a golf tournament, like you were saying, to other benefits for people. So talk about, that piece.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we have done since I took over, and it's not unique to me by any stretch, but, I think a lot about market orientation. So I took a course from Mark Ritson a bunch of years ago. It was probably the single best marketing program I've ever taken course. And I've taken lots of them. So that was a huge influence on how I see the world. And so I really wanted to start. I mean, there's also this other idea of you're flying a plane while you're fixing it. And so you're keeping things running as best as you can, while you're also trying to understand how the machine works, and what does this button do, and what's under this lever, and all those kinds of things. So I would say market orientation is really what I have been focusing a lot on. First, the strategy of how we're going to achieve on that vision, getting the board aligned. And then from there, over the course of the summer, and then more so in the fall, is doing a lot of market research to try and understand what would it take, or what would have to be true for us to become known as a world-class marketing association. We just did a really cool session with 50 handpicked people they weren't even all exclusively from the association, but just people that I met in my first period of onboarding that really want to make a bigger contribution to the community. And so invited all of them to this session and talked about what would have to be true for us to become known as a world-class association. We piped in some friends from Sweden who are in a similar organization and agencies out there with a really interesting perspective and mindset to give a global perspective. And then we also are running a survey in market right now that is asking marketers about trends that they're seeing in their roles and their positions from a budget perspective, channel perspective, but also from an ROI perspective. Because you've probably heard the Wanamaker dilemma that half my advertising is wasted. Trouble is I just don't know which half. I mean, that was about 125-ish years ago that he said that. And that's still the number one issue plaguing most marketers. So we're trying to dig into that question a bit more and figure out how do we know which half is wasted, and what are the challenges with solving for that. So that's been a big focus, I would say, on what I've been working on for the last few months anyway, specifically.
I like the exercise of thinking of that question actually that you brought up, which is what would make us a world-class, in this case, fill in the blank association for a company, asking partners, clients, other people, what would make us world-class? What's some of the feedback you got on how to become a world-class, in this case, association?
Yeah, and it's been interesting. I was going through some of the feedback. We had everybody write cue cards, and there's a whole moderated session that we had this woman named Erica that was helping us out. She did an amazing job. She runs a company called Good Seed. And so she was awesome helping us coordinate like all these people. So the idea was Calgary just went through a rebrand. We introduced Calgary's new branding as Blue Sky City. So we wanted to create this opportunity of like, this is a blue sky kind of conversation. And then we had the people from Sweden that were there talking about, well, here's how we kind of see world-class marketing, and here's what it means to us, and here's our journey over the last 100 years, because they've been around for a lot longer. And here's how we implement some of those ideas. And then from there was all the 50 people in the room writing down ideas they had on cue cards, and then collaborating and sharing ideas, exchanging ideas, and building out like stories around how this could come to life. So I just started going through all the cue cards today for this from the event that happened last week. And so there's 5 big themes that came out of it. One of them, and actually, let me just give me a second if you don't mind, because I actually have this hidden somewhere behind my screen.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of them was positioning is how I framed it. Now, like interpreting the categories of all these handwritten notes is, I just did it arbitrarily. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay. So I did that arbitrarily because it's hard to exactly classify these things, but positioning is a really important thing. So somebody else said this to me once when I was working in retail. There's a whole bunch of us that were sitting around a table, and this consultant came in and said, essentially, it's almost like you guys are ashamed of being retailers. And it might be a Canadian thing where there's an inferiority complex, or we just think less of ourselves than we maybe should. And so, but there's a positioning thing where some of it is just, if you want to be known as world class, then call that out, but be world class, right? So there's some of that, messaging came out of that from the group. There's another one around thought leadership, like a category around thought leadership. Things like having someone to drive the message, having a focus on the future and not just on the past. Communication, having it planned out, being thoughtful around it. One of the other categories was education. And that's one of particular interest for me, partly because of my background, partly because of my podcast as well. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of good stuff out there, but there's also a lot of junk. So it's a matter of kind of sifting through a lot of that stuff and being the curator of a lot of great things.
So with the education, it's kind of bleeds into curating from different great sources, not necessarily like the thought leadership is kind of what you were saying, the thought leadership of people, members or leaders of the organization, but the education kind of bleeds into the curation of other content out there.
Yeah. And like, as an example, I mean, you and I both have a bit of a science background. And so, if I say to you, like a big part of science is having the ability to have a predictable, repeatable outcome, confidence interval of like 95% and statistical significance of, 5.05, like those kinds of things matter a lot. So what that means is that if you do a study and you get a result, if you have a confidence interval of say 95%, it means that 95 times out of 100, you should get the same kind of result. So when we're talking about education and thought leadership, some of it is just talking about the things that already exist. And on the education side, some of it is there's a resistance to accepting things that didn't come from here. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel either, which could just be, let's redo the study. And if we get the same result, like they're telling us we should, then that actually can be something that's unique to us and puts our flavor on it, whether, like a B2B angle, which is something that the B2B Institute has done with a lot of B2C studies, or a Calgary-based angle, or a Canadian-based angle, or a North American-based angle for studies that have been, done that were focused on, say, a Chinese market or, a European market or, something like that, where people go, no, that's different. That's not the same as us.
So we have positioning, thought leadership, education. What was the next theme?
The next one, celebrating community, and then the last one was reach. So the celebrating community is around making it known that we have a great group of people, and we can talk a little bit about some of those examples that we have. But there's a lot of people that have done really cool stuff. We don't need to like manufacture stuff. Like we've already got really cool members that are doing amazing things and delivering incredible results and being recognized for it globally in a lot of cases, but aren't recognized for it locally. So there's that. And then
No, I
reach
love
is the last one.
Yeah, talk about reach.
That's just I mean, we can call it awareness, but it's really about reaching more people than you ever had before. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why that matters a lot. I always think about it in terms of, like, there's, for anyone that's followed Aaron Berg-Bass Institute's work, they might recognize it as mental and physical availability and the law of double jeopardy. And there's a whole bunch of marketing laws that exist out there. But another way I would think about it is, let's say because I had a former life as a sales guy. Let's say you're a sales guy and you've got a list of 10 clients. And for whatever reason, the manager that you are working with says you can never add any more clients to your list, but you can upsell them. So, okay, maybe you get 1 or 2 clients in the first year. Great. And then you can upsell them. And maybe you get a third client in the second year. But then maybe one of those 10 clients goes out of business. Maybe one of them just decides to shut down for whatever reason. Maybe one of them moves locations. And so your 10 all of a sudden becomes 9. The next year, maybe it's 8. The year after, maybe it's 7. And so if you arbitrarily set limits on who you can talk to and who you can do business with, then you're restricting, especially if it's just customers that you already have, you're restricting your potential for growth. So reach is a really important part.
Do you feel like some of the business you talk to have these restrictions they're putting on themselves?
Yeah, to some degree. And I think a lot of it has to do with the way you see the world. And so this is the market orientation part. If you see the world through the lens of your company, then you look at, in my cases with the Calgary Marketing Association, I might look at other competitors in Calgary as, who is another association that's based in Calgary? Let's say there aren't any. Then I go, look at me, I'm winning. I don't have any competitors. If I then go 180 and look at the landscape from the point of view of the customer, I might see that there's actually 14 at least associations in Canada. There's an infinite number of YouTube gurus and ninjas out there that are all claiming different things. There's people from around the world, like the Aaron Berg-Bass Institute, the B2B Institute, the Mark Ritson, the WARC. There's all these kinds of associations, the ANA, the ACA. Like, there's all these kinds of associations that, and even like people within my office that I might consider to be influential in helping educate and doing the same things that me as a business owner am trying to do for my customers, but I had never thought about them as competitors before.
You mentioned Mark Ritson, and it's one of the best marketing courses you've ever taken. What sticks out from what you learned?
So there's been a few times in my career where something like this has happened, and so what would it be without a Canadian talking about hockey? So at one point, I think Wayne Gretzky had said this, is like the game slowed down at some point for him. And he could just, like, that idea around, skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is. And so when you start seeing the surface of the playing field that way, you start anticipating where the puck is going to go. You're not as panicked anymore, and you're not like reacting to the thing that's right in front of you. You begin to skate to where the puck is going because you know it's going to go there. You're anticipating it's going to go there, and then you can adjust on the fly. So having taken Mark's course, it was one of those kind of like the game slowed down for me. After I took the course, I went, oh, like, this is how all this shit fits together. Like, oh, this is like how market orientation leads into strategy, which then leads into execution through the 4 Ps. And I didn't know, it just slowed everything down. I think I could have more meaningful conversations with anybody in any area of a business because it opened up, I could see where they were going.
Would you think it's because, was it just a very specific framework that allowed his ideas to be shared? Or what do you think it is about his material that slowed things down for you?
I think a lot of it has to do with having never had formal training. Like, And even later, just last year, I finished an MBA. And then I took an MBA level marketing course. And even during that, I still didn't get the same level of clarity as to how marketing works that I got through his course. And I think some of that has to do with he's got deep knowledge and extensive experience of having been in the trenches, done the things on a global scale. And he's also just a really, he's a little bit different in his courses. I would say he's gentler in his courses than he is publicly. Swears as much, but just gentler. And he's just a great teacher. Like I think it's just a combination of all those things that made the material, the framework, him as the deliverer of that material, the organization of the thoughts, all those kinds of things, just made it really accessible and super helpful.
I want to talk a little bit about Quatical and your work as a CMO. And one thing that I know you have thought about, and we talked about briefly before we hit record, is the 595 rule.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the 595 rule is a really interesting one because there's this idea around, we talk about lead gen all the time, and then we talk about demand gen or brand building and performance, or tactical and whatever you want to call the other thing as an opposite. Mental awareness, top of mind, bottom of funnel, top of funnel, all those kinds of differences. And so the 595 rule kind of looks at that. And what it basically says is that, and it came from research from John Dawes at the Ehrenberg Bass Institute. In any given market at any given time, there's about 5% of the market who are currently buying today. So, and that means there's 95% of the market that isn't buying today. So when you think about it that way, what's compelling is that there are two jobs of marketers. One is to capture demand that's happening now. And the other is to build future demand. That's a reference to James Herman's actually got a book about that. But there's a misconception that we can just turn on the taps, put a campaign in market and generate demand. And marketing doesn't work quite like that. And so if you think about current demand or in-market people and then out-of-market people or future market, in-market people, then the idea around future demand is really important because, especially in a B2B scenario, there's a new report that came out from Bain that said something like, I think it was 81% of all B2B buyers have a short list on day one. And the kicker is 90% of the time, they're picking a company from the day one list. So if you're not getting on the day one list, you're kind of shooting yourself in the foot. And so going back to Wanamaker's dilemma, you're kind of like, if you only focus on lead gen, you're missing out on a huge opportunity. But it's not to say that lead gen is the only thing that matters or that brand building is the only thing that matters. You need both.
Yeah, it reminds me of Dumb and Dumber, actually. So if you're not on the list, you don't have a chance. But there is.
So you're saying I got a chance?
Exactly. So you're saying there's a chance if I build demand, right?
And that's where I think a lot of marketing goes wrong, where you say stuff.
You're my new favorite guest because you can quote Dumb and Dumber. So of all time.
Perfect. But yeah, I think that's where a lot of marketing goes wrong is you make claims on things like we've got a demand gen person here and they're going to generate demand for us. And then that sets an expectation to somebody who doesn't know in the executive suite that says, okay, well, we got this demand gen person. This will just be a matter of time. Give them a week. And we all know that doesn't actually happen because maybe sales cycles are 6 to 12 months. And so, you're not manufacturing any demand. You're just capturing the stuff that's already in market. And if those people who are in market don't have you on their day one list, there's a really small chance they're going to pick you at the end anyway. So setting expectations is really important, I think, especially when you're communicating to a CFO, to a CEO, head of operations, people like engineers, IT people that don't really care that much about marketing other than they spend a lot of money. And where's the return? So if you start setting up an expectation that the return is going to be instantaneous, you're not going to do any favors for anybody.
How did Genesis Builder Group use 595 rule?
Yeah, so that was a client I had. And one of the things we did was, when I first heard about this rule, we just looked at that and said, okay, well, is it even real? And so as it turned out, we had a survey in market. And so we added this question within the survey to say, how soon are you looking at buying a home? And so weirdly enough, this law held up. It was 8% that was in market in the next 6 months. And then the remainder, 92%, that were not considering to buy in the next 6 months, but are considering to purchase. And it would be 6 months plus 6, 12, 18, 24 months, sometime in the future. So for us, that meant a lot of things. Depending on how much inventory there is available, like you might not be able to sell everything now. And so you're thinking about when those people are in market, how are they going to remember that brand, Genesis, compared to all the others that are out there? So there's things that we wanted to do to remind people over time to think about Genesis. And we also want to try and capture as much in-market demand as we could of people who are just looking for a quick possession home, let's say, or they're ready to make a decision now. They've already kind of selected their geographical location of where they wanted to go, and they just needed a little push over the edge kind of thing. So then there's incentives and that kind of stuff that works for them.
It's interesting, Mark, you talk about this because I just realized it's kind of happening real time. One of the podcast clients in the e-commerce world doing some consulting, and they were looking at creating like this custom formula. And I realized I've been getting emails from this one company probably for 6 years. I never really, at the time, until now, never had a need to introduce them to anyone or have someone use them until now. And so, like you were saying, they've been building that demand for 6 years, and now it comes to fruition that they don't even realize. So I totally get that, because I'm like, yeah, that company's been emailing me for forever. It seems like forever. So yeah, I totally get that. So it's important, because when the time strikes, and you just don't know when it's going to strike.
Well, and the other thing about that matters too, is that you can do stuff like measure the category entry points of decisions that prompt people to go into market. So we did that too with Genesis Builder. And funny enough, at one point, during COVID, I thought I discovered something. And so I called it Share of Triggers. And then I found out later on that the Aaron Burbass Institute already published a whole bunch of books about it and called it category entry points. So I'll use that language because they're smarter than I am, and they've got lots of documentation around it. But it's the same kind of idea, which is to say that general awareness actually is not important. What does matter is situational awareness. So when there's a specific trigger, that's a category entry point. You want to build awareness of your brand, memory of your brand. And this is the strategy part at the category entry points that matter for your brand.
I think, part of that also is differentiation, uniqueness. And I want to talk, I know that you've helped B2B SaaS companies, and I've had a bunch of SaaS companies on the podcast. And there's an instance we were talking about differentiation for a second. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, there's a bunch of years ago, I read this great book called Differentiation. I think the author's name was Youngmi Moon, I believe. And so it was a fascinating book because it was one of those first ones where I was like, no, this can't be right. I was like, what are you talking about? And the basic gist of the book is that in this race for differentiation, we all become the same. because we're benchmarking each other against each other and doing the exact same thing that everybody else is doing. And so you end up becoming this herd of sameness. So, and I think that's generally speaking pretty true for any category. It's really hard to maintain differentiation. It's really hard to hold on to that. Like Tesla is a good example that launched really differentiated, one of the only EVs in the market. Now there's hundreds of them. And Tesla would always say, we're never going to advertise. Yet at the same time, Elon Musk owns rocket ships and would put a Tesla inside the rocket ship, send it to moon, broadcast it everywhere. And like, so yeah, not marketing budget maybe, but not every company's got a couple $2 billion for PR stunts. So there's all those kinds of things that, and then even with them now, they're starting to advertise a lot more because there's a lot more competition. So holding on to differentiation is really hard, but there's a lot of benefits to it if you can do it. At the very least, if you can remain distinctive in the way that you brand yourselves and the way that creative looks and feels, and if it matches your website and matches the customer experience on the back end, and they see it in all the signage and logo and events and trade shows and all that kind of thing, then the distinctiveness will certainly is mandatory and is absolutely necessary, whereas differentiation isn't always sustainable. So coming back to the original question, there's a lot of companies that end up trying to benchmark each other and doing this exact same thing. So they end up using the same stock images, looking at the same like product in use. We have our list of features, they have their list of features. Here's our list of features compared to their list of features. And so it ends up looking, identical. And so I think that's a challenge. Like, and really there's also some more research that came out recently called the cost of dull. When you do that kind of stuff, it ends up just washing out. Like it's very boring, very dull. And when in that cost of dull report, what they found is that there is a ton of value in standing out and being truly different. A lot of that, especially in B2B, has to do with connecting with people emotionally, which is kind of different for B2B. Like the idea of, and I don't mean like emotionally as in like make people cry. I just mean like sometimes it's just a smirk, sometimes it's a nudge, sometimes it's like a wink, that kind of emotion. But the idea of nobody got fired for buying IBM, it matters a lot. So that's the number one reason why B2B buyers pick anything, is that they're not going to get fired. They're not afraid to make the wrong call. Because decision-making groups are so big and everybody's got so much influence, and you're talking about not just like, I bought the wrong flavor of pizza. You're talking about like this system we just bought that we spent a few $1 billion on and 10 years implementing is actually not the right thing. And so now you're fired because this is a terrible decision. So there's a ton of emotion in B2B. And I think connecting with people emotionally is a really important thing. Most B2B companies don't do it. So if you are looking at standing out, that's one of the ways you can stand out. Is not focus on featureitis, but just focus on making the person feel more comfortable and more trustworthy that they're not going to get fired for having picked your brand.
In that SaaS example, how were they, even though a lot of the companies like you were mentioning, if you look at the benefits and you compare, they are doing similar things, what would be an example of a different, or how you've seen like a SaaS company or company differentiate specifically?
Well, one of the things that we did was looked at how they currently were segmenting the market. So they go by industry vertical, which is what everybody does. So you go like construction, manufacturing, you name it, engineering, whatever the thing is, legal services, and that's what everybody does. But then you could also look at the market segment differently and say, well, what are the jobs people are trying to get done? And where are their unmet needs? And it doesn't matter if it's in any specific category or not, or industry vertical, because there could be a lot of similarities between categories for those things. So that's one of the first things you could do to start that and be different, is to look at the market differently, again, through that lens of market orientation. And then from there, it would be a matter of not having a lot of the same stock imagery of product in use, the same kind of thing as we've been around for so long. We've established in whatever it was, 1898 or something like that, and really just focus on the needs that the customer has, and focus on what matters to them and say how you can help.
You talk, Mark, about evidence-based marketing, right? You come from a science-related background. Give some example or an example of what you mean by evidence-based marketing.
Yeah. So there's a thing in marketing, I would say, that most people know about, which is it costs 5 times as much to make a customer than it does to keep one. So we all say that like it's gospel. And there's a majority of people that would say that they build businesses around that. And so then there's a whole bunch of things like loyalty programs that we invest in when we do that kind of thing. We talk about customer retention. We talk about the importance of upselling and cross-selling, largely because of that statement. When you look under the hood of that statement, it's actually a thought experiment that had really bad statistical validity. There was none. And there's no actual research that went into it. It's just an idea. But it's a really catchy statement, and it's stuck, and then it's printed in all of 17 editions of Kotler's textbook. And so we all say it and we all accept it as though it's fact. So there is zero proof behind that. And even if it were true, what does it even mean, really? Like, as we just talked about with that example of sales, like you're going to churn out customers. It's impossible not to over time. And so churn isn't necessarily the problem. It's acquiring more customers that's a problem. So even if it did cost 5 times more, you can't avoid acquiring more customers, because people die, businesses go, like, I don't mean to sound so dramatic, but there's a whole bunch of reasons, good ones, that have nothing to do with you as to why a company or you're not going to have a customer forever. So, a big thing in terms of the laws of marketing that exist out there is that's one of the laws of marketing, is that in a lot of cases, not a lot of cases, every brand needs to acquire more customers in order to keep growing.
When we're speaking of this topic, it makes me think of some of my favorite books. One book in particular, Predictably Irrational.
Oh, yeah.
And you had Dan Ariely on the podcast, one of my favorite authors. And that's one of my favorite books. I probably listen to it once a year on Audible. Talk about, I don't know if there's anything that came out of the podcast episode that was interesting, or just some of the things that you've learned from Dan Ariely.
Yeah, so he's got this new book called Misbelief. And so that's what we mostly talked to him about. But there's some really, he's just he's obviously very smart, very thoughtful, and all that kind of stuff. So we were kind of hanging off every word that he had. When I re-listen to that podcast now, I get same like you mentioned earlier, like I listen to certain things a lot because I find, depending on my state of mind, I learn different things from the same material. So one of the things that he had talked about at the beginning was something he talked about in one of his TED Talks way back when, which was this idea of pricing. There's an economist case study that he had worked on. So he saw this ad for The Economist, and it was the Economist ad was, you can get a subscription, digital only, for, let's say it was $50. Print only was $100. Print plus digital was $100. And so he's like, that's weird. That's surely a mistake. So he tried to get some information from them. They didn't reply. And then he's like, well, let me just run an experiment and see what happens. So, as you might imagine, the print plus the digital was what most people picked. It was something like, let's call it 90 to 95% of the people they surveyed said they picked that option. So very few people picked the online version, and nobody picked the print only option, which kind of makes sense because you're like, why would I bother? So then he's like, well, let's remove the print only option. And probably the answer is going to be the same, except it wasn't, which was crazy. And this is where we're predictably irrational, because all of a sudden it was something like 40-ish% of people then picked the digital only subscription, and 60% then picked the digital plus print. And so the rationale behind that is there's sometimes like we think our choices are our own, but in fact, people guide our choices a lot of times because of the things they're putting in front of us. So this print only option wasn't there for anybody to pick. It was there for you to compare. It was like a dummy option, but it created a perceived value so much higher for the combo offer that most people picked the combo offer.
His stuff is fascinating.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that sticks out from the?
Yeah, there's another part that he talked about where he's got an index fund actually, which is based on people's studies that he's done in organizations, and they measure the company's level of intrinsic motivation within a company. That's the only thing they measure. And based on that, companies that score high get into his index fund. And that index fund outperforms the S&P 500 over the last 2.5 years, I think it was, since they've launched it. Which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because he's not looking at financials at all. They're just purely picking companies that have a really high intrinsic motivation of employees. So it's kind of one of those ones where you're like, I got to go back and listen to that again, because I need to think more about how that happens. But I think for any of us that are trying to run a business, you want people to feel inspired. You feel good about the thing, because it's never just about the money. It's always about something else. And when that something else isn't there, then it only is about the money.
Yeah, his books are fascinating. So I encourage people to check it out. Marc, I have one last question. Before I ask it, I want to encourage people. You can check out more at Quatical.com. He has a link also to the podcast, which is the Barbers, or the Sleeping Barber Podcast. And also you can check out Calgary CMA just to learn what they're doing, because all that stuff can be applied to any business as well. My last question, Marc, is just, you mentioned some great books and resources, with Dan Ariely, and the marketing book of the Marc Risen. What are some of your other favorite books and resources that people should check out that you've learned from in marketing or business?
Yeah, totally. I mean, you have to start with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, and How Brands Grow. They've got tons of great stuff. That book is amazing. It's not an easy read.
What is it called?
How Brands Grow. There's part 1, part 2.
Got it.
But really anything that they produce is amazing. That was kind of those books are really amazing. And then there's like the B2B Institute's great. The WARC is great. The Swedish Advertising Federation that I had mentioned, Sverige, I can't ever pronounce the name. It's Sverige Agnosor or something like that. I'm trying to throw an accent in there to make it sound like I know what I'm saying, but those are awesome. They're great. And I think from Roger Martin is unbelievable. Our podcast is a big part of what we've been trying to do, is build up a library of all of these people and all these brands and all these companies that have been producing this type of evidence and have them on the podcast. So our podcast has a lot of these people too, if that's of interest to anybody. But I'd start with, those ones that I mentioned.
Love it. Marc, I want to be the first one to thank you. And everyone check out the websites I mentioned, check out the podcast, and we'll see everyone next time. Marc, thanks so much.
Thank you.
What I got, you can't buy. It resides between my eyes. Walked through the fire, came out better on the other side. See, life's like a beach if you find the sailing right now. I'm feeling like $100 grand.